People think Iran threatened every Gulf port because Iran wanted to sound strong. I do not think that is what happened. I think Iran threatened every Gulf port because it believes something very specific. Now it believes the system keeping it alive is holding. And once a state believes the system is holding, its language changes, its risk tolerance changes, and the geography of its threats expands. That is what happened here. No port in the region will be safe. That sentence is bigger than Hormuz. It is bigger than one blockade. It is bigger than one naval operation. It is the sound of a country saying, we no longer accept that this war will remain contained to the places you chose. And if you want to understand why Iran feels comfortable saying that after 46 days of war, after bomb facilities, after leadership losses, after all the destruction we have seen, then you need to stop looking only at Iran and start looking at the system around Iran. That system has four parts: oil money that still moves, ships that still sail, diplomatic cover that still blocks consensus, and a wider belief in Tehran that the next escalation is survivable. China sits at the center of all four, so let me walk you through this carefully, because I think most coverage is still separating events that belong together. This morning, S Iranian threat, America, S public silence. China's quiet but decisive support network. These are not three headlines. They are one structure. Let me begin with the threat. Security in the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman is either for everyone or for no one. No port in the region will be safe. Most people hear that and imagine the threat is aimed at Washington. I think that is a shallow reading. Washington already knows Iran can make shipping ugly. Washington already knows about the mines, the drones, the missiles, the fast attack vessels, the proxy capacity in Yemen. Nothing in that sentence was revelatory to the Pentagon. The real target was regional psychology. Iran was speaking to the Gulf states, not abstractly, directly. To the people running ports, terminals, investment zones, tanker schedules, and desalination systems. To states that have tried very hard to stay adjacent to the war without becoming the terrain of the war. Iran was telling them, if America continues the blockade, your cities, your ports, your trade, your water, your exports, your financial calm can all be brought into the equation. That is not simple saber rattling. That is diplomatic pressure wearing military clothes. Iran is trying to turn the Gulf states from silent watchers into active pressure points on Washington. And when you look at the regional response described in the source material, you can see why Tehran believes the tactic may work. Saudi Arabia is already urging Washington to back away from the blockade and return to negotiations because Riyadh fears Iranian retaliation against other shipping lanes and facilities. That is an extraordinary strategic reversal. The American move that was supposed to project pressure on Iran is generating anxiety inside the very regional order America claims to be securing. That tells you immediately this is no longer a simple contest of military capacity. It is a contest over who defines the risk for America as partners. And Iran is trying to define that risk more effectively than Washington is reassuring. Against it, now we need to ask the harder question. Why does Iran think it can afford to do this? Because this is where people keep making the same mistake. They assume confidence must come from battlefield superiority. Not necessarily. Confidence often comes from survivability. If a state believes the next punishment will hurt but not collapse it, that state becomes far more willing to escalate. And survivability is not just about missiles. It is about money, logistics, replacement, channels, political cover, time. This is where China becomes central. The source document gives numbers that should have shocked far more people than they did before the war. Iran was exporting around 1.68 million barrels per Dalton Y in March during intense fighting. The number climbed to 1.84 million in April so far. It remained around 1.71 million. Think about what that means. A country under American military pressure was not economically strangled in the way many predicted. The revenue line bent, but it did not break. In some periods, it improved. How? The answer is not hidden. China has spent years building a sanctions, resistant intake system for Iranian oil payments outside the ordinary dollar channels, secondary banking pathways beyond standard Western pressure points, dark fleet tankers sailing without normal transparency, refineries willing to process sanctioned crude, warehousing and storage arrangements designed for ambiguity. This was not improvised when the war started. It was pre-built that matters. Because when a war begins, the side with the pre-built workaround can absorb pressure very differently from the side that assumes pressure alone will be enough. Since the 28th of February, according to the reference material, 11.7 million barrels of Iranian crude have moved to China. That number is more than an oil statistic. It is a political statistic. It tells Tehran the lifeline is functioning. And once Tehran sees the lifeline functioning, the psychological logic changes. You are no longer asking, how do we survive the next week? You are asking, how far can we push before the other side decides the price is too high? That is a very different mindset. Now add the second element. The ships do not only move oil, they move proof. Every time a sanctions-resistant vessel completes a run, that is proof that the system still works. Every time the dark fleet escapes suffocation, that is proof. Every time China keeps buying, that is proof accumulates. And in war, accumulated proof becomes strategic confidence. Then comes the third element, diplomatic cover. China does not need to hold a dramatic press conference saying it is fully aligned with Iran in every detail. In fact, it is more effective when China does not say that. What matters is what China does. It keeps the commercial lifeline open. It criticizes the blockade, it stays in contact diplomatically, it helps prevent the formation of a total international consensus against Tehran. That matters enormously because Iran does not need universal approval. It only needs enough friction in the international system to prevent America from converting military pressure into comprehensive isolation. China helps create that friction, and then there is the fourth element, the one that turns resilience into escalation. Potential weapons support. The source material notes U.S. intelligence reporting that China is preparing to send shoulder-fired anti-aircraft systems to Iran through indirect channels. Whether that transfer fully materializes or not, the signal itself matters. Tehran sees that support may not stop at oil purchases and rhetorical positioning. It may move into practical battlefield aid that is deniable but real. That possibility changes calculations. Now put all four together. Revenue still flows. Shipping workaround still functions. Diplomatic friction still protects space. Possible military support hovers in the background. That is the system. And once you see the system, the Iranian threat looks very different. No port in the region will be safe. That is not the voice of a state acting out blindly. It is the voice of a state that believes the ladder beneath it is solid enough for one more step up. This is why I keep coming back to what I call the confidence ladder. Iran did not wake up one morning and jump from a straight dispute to a threat against every Gulf port out of nowhere. It climbed into that position first. Hormuz restrictions proved durable enough to matter. Then selective passage arrangements showed Iran could shape traffic politically, not just militarily. Then outside powers discovered reopening the situation was harder than slogans suggested. Then China kept buying oil. Then blockade enforcement showed visible limits. Then the gap between what Washington threatened and what Washington actually enforced became harder to ignore. Then talk of Chinese assistance entered the picture. Each event by itself looks manageable. Together they produce a ladder, and every rung teaches the same lesson: escalation is painful, but still survivable. That is what changed Iranian behavior, not magical strength, structured confidence. Now let us talk about America's silence, because I think the silence is one of the most revealing facts in the whole episode. As of the moment described in the source document, Washington had not issued a direct formal answer to the threat against every Gulf port. Some people see that and say America looks weak. I think the reality is more complicated and, in a way, more alarming. America is trapped between two bad options. If Washington publicly answers with a hard counter threat, it risks accelerating the confrontation just as the ceasefire clock approaches the 21st of April and diplomatic channels are still technically alive. If Washington stays publicly vague, it preserves negotiating room but creates fear in the Gulf that America may not be ready to respond clearly. If Iranian pressure spreads to regional infrastructure, so the silence is not an absence of calculation. It is the sound of conflicting calculations colliding. But here is the Iranian advantage. Iran does not need America to sound weak to the whole world. It only needs America to sound uncertain to the Gulf. That is enough. If Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and others begin asking whether the blockade is making them less safe, instead of more safe, then Iran is already winning an important part of the diplomatic game. That is why the threat was phrased regionally. Iran was pulling on coalition seams, and the source material is clear that those seams are real. Now let us ask a question that Washington should be asking itself much more openly. If China is central to Iran's survivability, where's the China component in America's strategy? Right now, the strategy looks narrow. Pressure Iran, negotiate with Iran, threaten Iran, blockade Iran, but the support architecture helping Iran endure is not contained within Iranian borders. It runs through Chinese finance, Chinese purchases, Chinese-linked shipping logic, and potentially Chinese-supplied military aid. A strategy that ignores the support architecture is not really a strategy for ending the war. It is a strategy for punishing one visible node while the deeper system keeps replenishing its ability to resist. And this is where I think the current American posture is most vulnerable. Trump threatened tariffs on China if it arms Iran, while also publicly doubting that China is doing the very thing U.S. intelligence says it may be doing. That contradiction is devastating. You cannot deter credibly while sounding unsure of your own case. China hears that. Iran hears that. The Gulf hears that. And every contradiction like that becomes another rung on Iran's confidence ladder. Now, let me pull the camera back because there is one more layer here that matters. Systems do not become visible until pressure tests them before this war. People could talk casually about sanctions, oil controls, maritime pressure, alliance leverage, and coercive diplomacy as if these were simple tools. This war has shown that the real question is never whether a tool exists on paper, it is whether your opponent has already built a system around the tool Iran did, with China's help. And now the war is revealing the consequences of that preparation. The blockade hurts, but it does not strangle. The pressure scares. But it does not isolate completely. The bombings damage. But they do not end the revenue stream. The diplomatic isolation never fully closes. That is what a functioning support system looks like under pressure. And what happened this morning was that Iran acted like a state that trusts its support system. That should worry Washington much more than the words alone, because words can be answered. Systems have to be broken, and breaking a Chinese-backed commercial and diplomatic support system is a much harder task than threatening another round of strikes. Now let us talk about the 6 days ahead. The ceasefire expires on the 21st of April. That means the next 48 to 72 hours are not just about rhetoric. They are about signals. If America now responds directly and specifically to the threat against Gulf ports, Washington is signaling it is prepared to risk a broader confrontation to restore deterrence. If it avoids a formal answer and keeps working through intermediaries, it is signaling that the blockade and public messaging are only one layer of a strategy still searching for a negotiated exit. And if the China dimension starts being addressed more directly in meetings, statements, or pressure channels, then Washington has finally admitted something this war has already demonstrated. This is not just a US-Iran problem. It is a US-Iran problem sitting inside a US-China competition. I do not know which path Washington will choose, but I do know this. The headline this morning was not the real story. The real story was the infrastructure beneath the headline. Iran's threat was visible. The system that made the threat plausible was quieter. Oil still moving, money still flowing, ships still finding routes, diplomatic cover still operating possible weapons, support still hovering in the background. That is the engine of the moment. So when you look at this morning's statement, do not ask only whether Iran will act on it. Ask why Iran feels economically and strategically able to make it at all. That question takes you past the speech and into the machinery. And once you are looking at the machinery, the war looks very different. It stops looking like a simple contest between blockade and resistance. It starts looking like a contest between pressure and a pre-built resilience architecture. That is a much more difficult war to win. And that is why I think the deepest lesson of this moment is not about one threat, one port, or one press cycle. It is about how great power competition now works. Not always with flags and fleets. Sometimes with payment systems, sometimes with quiet shipping networks, sometimes with refineries nobody outside the specialist world ever talks about. Sometimes with diplomatic friction that prevents total consensus. Sometimes with enough support to make your partner believe the next escalation can be survived. That is what Iran learned. That is why its language expanded, and that is why America's silence matters so much, because silence in a moment like this is not empty. It is heard by allies as uncertainty and by adversaries as data. Iran just collected more data, and the data from Tehran's point of view says the system is still working. That is the real significance of this moment. Not that Iran threatened every Gulf port, but that after 46 days of war, it had a reason to think it could.